All right. Well, good evening. It's good to see those who are able to be here and also those visiting with us. As Adam mentioned, we're going to be in the book of Matthew, so go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 1. And that's where we will spend all of our time this evening looking specifically at the genealogy and the things surrounding the genealogy of Jesus. And hopefully when I say that, that just gets you super excited. These are things typically we get to a bunch of names that we don't know how to say, and we just skip on right by them. But tonight we're going to dig into it, try to understand it a little bit better. And thank you to Mara for the suggestion. This was her idea to kind of study this. And so I'm excited to do that. I'm glad she encouraged me to do that. And thank you to Adam for encouraging me to teach this. So as I've titled this, as we'll see how Matthew starts the book, Jesus, Son of God. Son of David. He is the Son of God, but he's also the Son of David. Let's go ahead and read chapter 1 together. If you didn't have a chance to read over it, that way we'll all be literally on the same page. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers, at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. Now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took his wife, but knew her not until she had given birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. So right out of the gate, like many books, Matthew kind of sets the tone of what his book is going to be about, what his gospel is going to center around. And I think that mostly has to do with the first verse there that we see. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So Matthew spends a lot of time right here talking about throwing it all the way back to the promises that God gave in the Old Testament, specifically to two important people, and that was David and Abraham. So if you go back and think about our study in Samuel, God promises these things in the book of Samuel. So in 2 Samuel 7, he talks about David being in the line of the one to come, the king that is going to have his throne established forever. So it's a promise. One of the reasons Matthew writes this genealogy is to focus on the promises that God has given his people all the way back to Abraham, then to David, and eventually through Jesus. So he says, when your days are fulfilled and when you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And then also, as we know, to Abraham, he is the son of Abraham, and that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, where it says, and I will make of you, Abraham, a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So Matthew kind of sets the tone in this first chapter, talking about the promises that were made of where Jesus was going to come from. And that goes all the way back to the promises he gave to Abraham and to David. What do you think the importance is of, I'll open it up here as we talked about, this is going to be kind of a class. What do you think the importance is of Matthew emphasizing those things? What do you see? Yeah, Brian.
You're seeing a line back to the promise. Matthew's right to Jews. And so each of the Gospels are trying proving Christ to be the Messiah. And so Matthew's tying it into their literal physical relationship to Abraham and that's promised. God fulfilling those, connecting the line between all those generations of Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. You see a lot in the Gospels, especially the interactions between Jesus and the Jews, going back and forth where the Jews hang their hat. They hang it a lot on we're sons of Abraham. That's our guy. And so Matthew is setting the tone here that Jesus came from him. He's part of that line. Anything else?
I find it interesting that he doesn't call him son of Abraham. It's specifically son
David.
of David.
Yeah.
He doesn't go back to the beginning of the promises. It's to the kingly promises. So he, like Brian said, he's the right physically and spiritually from God.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's an interesting segue into our next idea, and that's that this is written with a purpose. If you've studied any genealogies at all, you're aware that Luke also has a genealogy, and interestingly, there are none of the same names except for two in that list. We're not going to get into all of that and try to figure all that out. We don't have time for that. But suffice it to say, this is not an exhaustive genealogy, but it's a purposeful genealogy. Matthew's writing it, the names that he's listing here have a purpose. And so getting back to Mara's point, starting with the idea that it's the son of David, we're going to see that carry out all the way through the whole book of Matthew. I think I was able to come up with at least 8 times where Matthew uses this phrase, son of David. It's a very important part to this gospel. starting off obviously in chapter 1, verse 1 that we just read. And then in 9:27, two blind men call out to Jesus, "Son of David, have mercy on us." In 12:23, the crowd asks, "Could this be the Son of David?" after Jesus heals a demon-possessed man. And then in 15:22, a Canaanite woman pleads with him, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me." In chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, another two blind men cry out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." 21, verse 9, during the triumphal entry, the crowds are shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David." In 21:15, children in the temple cry out, "Hosanna to the Son of David." And then interestingly, in chapter 22, Jesus is questioning the Pharisees about the Messiah, and he says, "What do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he?" And they reply, "The Son of David." So they are looking for the one to be the Messiah is going to be the Son of David, and that's the purpose that Matthew is giving here in this genealogy, is to prove he is the Son of David. He has the rightful heir to, he's the rightful heir to the throne of Israel, and it'll be spiritual Israel, obviously. But just interesting that he carries that all the way through the book and such a focus on that. And as we know, Matthew is writing mostly to Jews, and so he's trying to explain to them and prove to them that Jesus is through this line, because that would be very important to them. And so that's the purpose that he's writing this through, is to prove that Jesus is the Messiah because he is the Son of David. Any thoughts or comments there? Yeah, Barry.
Well, just along that same line, it's a very kingdom emphasis. So, as you're alluding to, with David being king, they're looking for this new king, the restoration of the kingdom of Israel. And kingdom of heaven is used 37 times in Matthew. So a lot of emphasis on that. This genealogy is lending itself to that restoration. Quotation of a virgin will be with child, and that comes out of Isaiah 7 and 8, which talks about God at Emmanuel with us, God saving Israel from utter extinction, but saving only a remnant. So here is the one who is come to save the remnant.
Yeah, exactly. Any other thoughts so far? Yeah, Brian.
I think along the same lines too, what Barry just said. The shows in 2 Samuel. So, time that David did it covenant, Jesus is the fulfillment of that. And as you already said, he has a lot to teach them. As the Jews are looking for this physical kingdom, they know that there's going to be a king on the line of David whose throne will last forever, and who's going to bring peace. But they're thinking of that in the physical way.
Right.
And that's what, as you're saying, Matthew's message is trying to show first that, yes, he is from that line. He's the Son of David to fulfill that for the purpose of doing.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Kingly quality that it's bringing out in David and in Jesus. And Abraham was a king, but the promise came to him, and that promise was going to be through his seed. In other words, a birth promise. And in the New Testament, we're told that we are to be messengers of this king, and that we can ourselves be born into a relationship where we get to root. The blessed part of it, what is the blessed? It's mentioned 3 times in that very first verse that, and everything that you put, that there would be a blessing. So that blessing has to do with that king and with the promise of Abraham. I think sometimes we don't realize what the king part of it means, not only to Jesus and to the Jews that he had to be born of the house of David, but as Christians.
Yeah.
Because the kingship is.
So again, just to kind of wrap that up, did you have a comment on? If he is the son of David, he is the Christ, or he is the Messiah, and that's what the Jews were looking for. They knew that, and so Matthew's purpose here is to prove that. Another message he's trying to send. I really started stretching on the P thing after this, so just ignore me. The first one just worked really well. It was promised, it was purposeful. Now I'm stretching it a little bit, but well, just go with me. So now it's kind of a pessimistic genealogy. So the way that he structures this genealogy kind of leaves, especially towards the end, kind of leaves you in the dark. It kind of puts a little sourness to it. When you first start out, everything, you're reading some of those names. A few of them you may not be super familiar with, but most of them you've seen before. They're quote-unquote heroes of the Bible, and especially towards David, as we've talked about in our Samuel study. There for a while, David was the pinnacle of the Israelite nation. He was winning every battle that he went into. God was blessing the nation through him. He was a man after God's own heart. Everything looked to be perfect through him. And then it just comes crashing down. So the first section we see all the way up to David, and then after that we see all the kings listed there, all the way to the time that they were taken over by Babylon and went into exile. And then we read this last section of a few names we know: Jeconiah, Shealtiel, Zerubbabel, and then things get a little bit more nebulous. We don't really know much. The only time the rest of these names are mentioned after basically the end of 13 through the rest of the genealogy, we really don't know much about them. This is the only time they're mentioned. So there's kind of this dark period waiting for Jesus to show up, or somebody who is going to save the people. And so the way Matthew structures this, you kind of feel that, especially if you're familiar with these characters. And some of the kings, hopefully some of them make your stomach turn, because they were absolutely terrible, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But just the structure of this genealogy kind of shows the rise and fall of the physical Israelite nation. And what the Jews had to be thinking is, if David is not the Messiah, who can be the Messiah? Even David fell to his own humanity, and so who is going to save them? But before we answer that, I want to go to kind of the idea of these specific characters. So this is a personal genealogy, and in that I mean we can relate to it. These people are not far from us. When we start to look through the list of who Matthew names here, it sends a very clear message about the character of these people and what Matthew was trying to say by including these people. Just think about a few of these with me. I won't look at all of them, but Abraham. What do we know about Abraham and his deception, his lying, his lack of faith in taking Hagar as his concubine? Think about Jacob. He was also a deceiver. He had deceived his father, his brother, in attaining the birthright. Judah obviously had some problems, and it mentions it specifically here. He fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. So that was his daughter-in-law. And so that was not a great situation. Rahab was a prostitute. But thankfully she showed faith and saved her family. Solomon We know a lot about him. He married foreign wives, turned to idolatry, took his heart away from the Lord. Rehoboam split the nation. He was part of the reason the division occurred because of his arrogance, and he just allowed idolatry to roam rampant. Probably the two that stand out to me most in terms of evil, Ahaz and Manasseh. Just extreme wickedness, practicing all sorts of evil, even child sacrifice. And then just the way that Matthew says David. He doesn't, most of these you see, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah, and Judah the father of Perez. But he gets to David and he says, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. He purposefully chooses to include the adultery of David, to highlight it, to remember it. He includes that here. He didn't have to. David fathered Solomon, but he includes the fact that it was by the wife of Uriah, that it was not somebody David had a right to. And so you get to the end of this, and you just think, obviously, there are none righteous, not one. And so it's very relatable. You can see yourself in the text. But I really like the transition from that line of thinking and then look down at verse 21. It says, she will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. After reading through the character qualities and the failings of those in this list, all these people, even in the line of Jesus, need to be saved from their sins. And so it's a beautiful picture of drawing that and then coming to Jesus, whose name literally means Yahweh saves, or the Lord will save. And this is going to be the king who saves his people from their sins. So it's just a beautiful way to draw that as Matthew writes this genealogy. It's very artistic in that all these people need to be saved. Who is going to do that? It cries out, who's going to save these people? And there's Jesus, whose name means the Lord will save. So I just found that to be very picturesque. So any thoughts, comments on that? Yeah.
I didn't hear your question, but
You can go anywhere. Yeah.
this section, this concept to me is super interesting when you look at all. I look at the Manasseh and misfits that he includes, because calls out Rahab. So not only she when she's a Gentile,
Right.
we assume proselytizes,
Yeah.
right? Calls out Ruth, same thing. The whole Tamar and Judah situation. Like, he didn't have to even mention
Right.
Tamar,
Right.
but he specifically calls her out. And then again, he mentioned again, he doesn't have to call out Bathsheba, but he certainly didn't have to say the wife of Uriah.
Yeah.
Right? And so, to me, part of what's so interesting in this is if you are a Jew, when you start this, remember, like, oh yeah, the genealogy of the Christ. Like, I believe in this. It's a great thing. I'm glad I'm part of that lineage and that line. And then, kind of sprinkled throughout, all these kind of down notes that should highlight to you that you don't come from a perfect people, right?
Yeah.
And I think it clearly does it for a reason. That, it wouldn't be accidentally if it was one, but there's all these examples of people and things we would not include in a genealogy of a king if we didn't have to, right?
Right.
So I think he's telling us a lot of information by sharing that those pessimistic issues in the genealogy that have no reason to be there. So they have to be first.
Yeah, exactly. Any other thoughts? Anything else you see along those lines? Yeah.
We didn't have to mention women at all, as Adam said. And I find it
Yeah, absolutely. And most genealogies talk about the father of, and that's you heard that a lot. But every so often he would just put a woman in with that, and it would stand out to any of the Jews reading this that he was mentioning them, because that's not typically how they would write that or refer to it. And then also kind of along those lines, again, we see the idea that all these broken people, these people who need to be saved, if you drop down to verse 23, it says how that's going to happen. It says, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. Similar to what Barry just mentioned about how that comes from Isaiah 7. But focusing specifically on the meaning of Emmanuel, God with us, the virgin birth, the fact that this comes out of unnatural means, only God could do this. Only God can save, and only God can accomplish it this way. We are not able to save ourselves from our sins. We can't do anything to correct our sinfulness. God has to do that. And how comforting it is to have Emmanuel, God with us, who is going to accomplish that, because only he can save. And so it's just a beautiful picture of Jesus being able to bridge that gap between our broken selves and God's holiness, and being able to connect those again. So it's just a beautiful picture of who we are, and then what Jesus is going to accomplish as he enters the world. He is God with us. Any other thoughts on up to that point? Any other comments, anything you're thinking about? All right. So the last section that I have is kind of what Mara was alluding to there, and a little bit of what Adam was saying. He did not have to include a lot of these women here. And specifically, the ones he does include are Gentiles, considered sinners. They're marginalized. They're not the heroes of faith that we would think they are. But their lives are demonstrations of God's ability to bring about reversal. Barry talks a lot about reversing the curses from the garden. And these women have a very specific story, each of them, about how they were redeemed, especially like Ruth or Rahab, who displayed great faith, Tamar, who was treated poorly, but her sinfulness was overcome, Judah calling her more righteous than I, Bathsheba being allowed to be the mother of Solomon, who eventually was going to continue this lineage, be a part of Israel's heritage. And then the final kind of ultimate woman, obviously, Mary, who was going to birth Jesus. And I spend a lot of time thinking about that, especially in these times of the shame around sexual relations outside of a marriage. It's not as shamed, obviously, in our culture, sadly enough. But in this culture, you were completely ostracized. It was absolutely shameful. And I just think about the intense faith that Mary had to have to live basically the rest of her life in that state of everybody always looking down on her, of she was an adulteress. And just the faith that she had, I mean, it says it in such short sentences, but I think we would do well to think about just how much ridicule and shame she bore in order to be the mother of Jesus. And obviously she was prepared to do it. God knew she could do it, and that's why he chose her. But that's just a fantastic representation of the faith we should have, to be able to stand up against any of the ridicule we might receive as being trying to do God's will and God's purposes. Mary had to spend her entire life dealing with that, and just a great example of faith to me. Any thoughts on that? Any other comments before we kind of wrap things up? Yeah.
I had one more talk I had not considered the multiple examples of women who dealt with sexual sin. Clearly, I mentioned that in a way, but I hadn't thought of comparing that to then we have Mary who has no sexual sin, has no relations, and bears a son. That's a really interesting way. Each of those women were redeemed despite their sin. And then each of us is allowed to be redeemed because Mary, at that point, even though people would consider her sinful, was sinless and in the bearing of Jesus. That's a really beautiful way to think of an ultimate redemption of all those women who came before Mary and overcame their sin. And now she enables that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a beautiful picture. Well, I kind of open it up. Any other thoughts, anything that came to your mind about this whole chapter? Any thoughts you want to share or discuss right now? Yeah, Chip.
To me, this genealogy from the very get-go from Matthew is the introduction to his purpose of his whole book. Mm-hmm. So when we read Matthew, just heads up if it hasn't been said before, when you read Matthew, he's presenting Jesus as the king. So no matter how he presents Jesus throughout the book, he's looking at Jesus in his kingly role. King of a nation, the leader of a kingdom. So there's going to be a lot of that talk in the book of Matthew. The other Gospels have their aim as well. But if we lose sight of that, sometimes, I don't know that it hurts anything, but I do think it helps clarify sometimes when he's talking in this book about certain things that you might say, why is he going on about that? And because his purpose is to present Jesus as the king. Compare that to the book of John. John is trying to present him as the Son of God. Mm-hmm. So his purpose, so you don't find the same story. You don't find the same miracles. You don't find some of the same things dealt with in those two books. So the purposes are completely different. So you just need to keep that in mind. And this is, to me, so beautiful. He starts out by saying that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of David. Right away, we're going to talk about the Son of a King. Mm-hmm. And the whole rest of the book is about the support of that king.
Exactly.
And he's a rejected king. You know, by the end of the story in Matthew, he's a rejected king. He's crucified on the cross. So, think of this book from beginning to end. That's what you got.
Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, Barry.
Just add one other thing. This is very obviously a message at the beginning of the crushing of Satan's head, because Genesis 3:15, that first great prophecy, the seed of woman specifically is going to crush the head of Satan. And here you have Mary giving birth without Joseph. You got, if you read King James Version, you got 39 begats throughout this chapter, and there is a absence of begat between Joseph and Jesus, and therefore the seed of woman conquers Satan, and Satan is the one who triggered her to start sinning, and she turns around then and destroys him as she gives birth to them. So that's another cool reversal.
For sure. Yeah, Adam.
I think it's interesting that he starts the chapter by saying, the book really by saying, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And so he doesn't say like, hey, this is the introduction. The introduction is a genealogy. He's presenting the entire book as the genealogy of Christ. And interestingly, he starts telling us how Christ is the son of David. And then the very end of the book, in chapter 28, he tells us how everyone else joins that genealogy as well. And so it's not just an introduction that is the genealogy of Christ. The book itself is a genealogy of Christ before him and the genealogy of what will come after him, which is us.
It's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. Yeah. Yeah, Jacob. I'm sorry? Peggy? No. Go ahead.
I was just thinking about what kings do, and they unite seemingly disjointed people and make them a common nation, a common kingdom. In this case, we saw that with David and Saul, and so maybe by mentioning some of these characters that you talked about tonight, he wasn't disassociating himself from humanity and the world, the good, the bad, the ugly, but everyone had something that they could have in common with who he was and what he was coming to accomplish.
Yeah. Yeah, Mark.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but all of the kings that are listed they were failures. Their kingship ended in a failure. And how Jesus' kingship, his kingdom that is promised through David, is forever and will never fail.
Yeah, I don't know that all of them were failures. Some of them had better things than others. But your point still stands. Eventually, their sins went before them, and they did fail in that sense. And then even David, the great king, failed. Yes, it leaves that image of, well, who's going to be the king if all the kings of Israel fail? And obviously, speaking physically, the nation's going to come to an end, but spiritually, Jesus is going to lead the new Israel as the king that will be eternal. Any other thoughts before we wrap it up? I was hoping you would say something.
I think it's kind of really think about the character of Joseph, and it's probably an arranged marriage of one another their whole lives. They were supposed to be joining families, and even before he knew what would happen to him, he still wasn't sort of the shape or not his faith or anything like that. So just his character would be shows.
Yeah. Absolutely, and the faith that, it says it so simply, but he knew her not until she had given birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. It kind of reminds me of the story of Noah when he's building the ark. He builds the ark, and he did it. All that God commanded him, Noah did it. Same thing with Joseph. We just see his faith leading him to do the things that God is asking of him. So, yeah, definitely an example there. All right. So to kind of just wrap this all up, I kind of put together a closing thought. And then after I read this, I'll turn it back over to Adam and we'll stand and sing a song. So Matthew 1 reminds us that God works through messy, broken people and situations to fulfill his promises. He brings hope, redemption, and salvation through Jesus, who is our Savior from sin, God with us, and our eternal King. So thank you for your attention. We'll sing a song now.